Normally, I make YouTube videos when I am well rested, healthy, peace of mind, have a little bit more makeup on. But this is gonna be a bit of a chaotic video. Stop pulling at the blinds. I'm a good cat mom. This is gonna be a chaotic video because I am doing this primarily to keep myself awake. And I have been awake, like 32 hours or something. So what had happened was, I don't know if you noticed what happened on January 6th in the United States when the Confederate flag was flying inside the Capitol building, among other things. And while none of that was surprising, it was still awful. And that combined with starting a semester, having a higher workload, having more TA work, taking on some freelance theater work, as well as doing an internship, I kind of lost it just a little bit and then just like didn't sleep. Or barely slept, excuse me, hyperbole, for like a week and a half, which then spiraled into me getting behind on a lot of my work. Long story short, I have been awake, just marathoning consciousness, and I'm finally done with everything I need to be done in order to be caught up on my work. And I'm just trying to stay awake because if I fall asleep now, then I won't be able to go to sleep tonight, and this vicious cycle will start all over again. That being said, two good things happened in January. The new president and vice president were sworn in without being assassinated, and I hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Both of those are equally important, obviously. If you are someone who voted for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, thank you. If you're someone who subscribes to this channel, thank you. If you are neither, fair. That's honestly, that's fair. But let's just jump into it. The first adult book that I finished this month was Daughter of Fortune by Isabelle Allende. Now this was a historical fiction romance adventure book set in Chile, in the territories of California, in London, and in China throughout the 1800s. And the star of the book is Eliza Summers, a woman of unknown origin who ends up on a crate wrapped in a man's sweater on someone's porch, gets adopted, grows up in this life of luxury, but once she falls in love with this poor, passionate, intelligent revolutionary who wants to make his fortune in California during the gold rush, she ends up following him across the ocean and putting her life on a completely different track. I did mention this book, and I said that it had a cringeworthy romance in my makeup and books tag, and that is the initial romance, that is the inciting incident, but they're young and dumb. It's fine. One of the reasons I love this book is Isabelle Allende has so much attention to detail with historical, I'm not going to say accuracy, but with historical framing and historical possibility, to borrow a phrase from books like Whoa, who has a really excellent video essay on the problem with historical accuracy that I'll put in the description. And while I don't know everything about Chile or about China or about the gold rush or about the way trade expanded, the role of sex work and all these places, it was a world that I could easily just lose myself into. And that's something I really wanted at the beginning of the year. I will say, just to account for some criticisms I've heard of the book, some people go into it expecting it to be immediately fast-paced, immediately romance, adventure, and all these things. The first 80 to 100 pages are Eliza's childhood and growing up. I find that information really helpful because it plays out later, especially in the character development, but I can see how that would be boring if you're someone who likes to immediately be thrown into it. Also, some people criticize the structure of the novel, in which, although Eliza is the main character, Allende does take time to delve into kind of 1 to 2 chapter deep dives of other supporting characters, which I loved because it provided just so much color and texture to the world. And when you saw Eliza after those moments interacting with these characters, knowing their backstory, and as the reader knowing things that Eliza doesn't know, makes their interactions so much more rich. Another thing I love about this book is the diversity in it. You have Chileans, you have Mexicans, you have Englishmen and Frenchmen, you have indigenous people, you have Black people, you have trans people, you have found families, you have all of these interesting, diverse relationships in terms of romantic love as well. You have the highborn and the lowborn young teenage love. You have the interracial relationship. You have the friends to lovers trope. You have the unrequited love, the passionate, torrid, illicit affair between the older married man and the young woman. And I just really, really enjoyed seeing all these relationships examined and juxtaposed and constantly being asked the question of what is love? How do you cultivate your identity and your life? And what would you do to create the life that you feel you deserve? I would absolutely recommend this book, and Also, shout out to the translator. I forgot her name, but I'll put her name on the screen since this book was originally written in Spanish. And although I do not read Spanish, I didn't feel stilted or awkward to me. I did not feel like it was a bad translation as far as someone who only speaks one language can tell. The next book that I read this month was Friends in Dark Shapes. This was also a NetGalley arc. And the reason I'm like easing into it is because I want to speak carefully. I am someone who normally does not DNF books, but I wanted to when I was reading this book. However, once I got a third of the way in, I was glad I didn't because I was totally captivated. This book focuses on a young woman who is grappling with like just so much real legitimate life stuff that I identify with, but grappling with the gig economy and understanding her role in Australia as a person of color, but also someone who's not Aboriginal, looking at the life that her friends are leaving, the life that she wants to leave, kind of 30 somethings and all of these things after the death of her father, the man she's incredibly close with. And the book is actually a series of about 60 vignettes broken up over the course of the year in chronological order, but separated by the seasons that show her developing and growing and changing. The two reasons that I struggle with this book is one, Australia is less of a setting and more of a character. There are so many references to the cities and beaches and towns, and I later learned that the author is from there. There are so many moments where the main character is like connecting her emotional and mental state to the gentrification, to the physical landscape around her, to the weather. And it was so specific and personal. And they were throwing out all these names and all these references that I was like, I bet if I had been to Australia or had lived in Australia, this would be resonating and hitting on a different way. But it really isn't. And that sometimes distanced me from the story because I'm not a native to that country. The second thing, and this was the main thing that made me want to quit the book, but once I got adjusted to it, I learned to enjoy it, is this writer's style, and not necessarily the vignette. Like that I'm totally fine with. And there's another book I read this month that fit that mode. I don't know what the word for it is, but she was speaking in first person, but it was as if the things were happening. So it wouldn't be she sat down on the counter or I sat down on the counter. It would be like sitting down on the counter, I thought this, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then I don't know what the terminology is for that. If someone knows, please let me know, because it was the first time that I had ever read something like this. But I found it challenging because I could tell that we were, following her and we were following her journey. And I could tell that the action of the book was happening as I was reading it, as opposed to this has happened in the past, or I'm coming at this from one perspective, trying to understand all these things. But it was very, very different and new for me. And I apologize if I'm not describing that well, but it was just my first time interacting with it. And I just did not like it at first. However, the strength of her writing, her beautiful prose, the creative metaphors that she used, and the topics that she talked about, the way that she articulated things that I myself have wanted to articulate, but never could, about relationships, about trying to find your place in the world, all of that wrapped up to a very melancholy and hopeful book that I genuinely enjoyed. I do not know if it is something I would reread in my entirety. And for those of you who know my channel, whether or not I would reread a book is a big sign of how I feel about it. But I would definitely go back and reread individual vignettes, because that's one of the pros and cons of a book like this, is that if you're in a section that you don't like, in a few pages it'll be done. But also I felt that some were much stronger than others. But I am glad that I read this book, and if that kind of style is of interest to you, I think you'll really enjoy it. But this seems to be a matter of taste. I also noticed when I read some of the other reviews on NetGalley, it was like, I love it or I hated it. And it seemed to be for some of the similar reasons I was mentioning. Another NetGalley arc that I read that I unashamedly absolutely loved, will be buying this book when it comes out so I can read it on a hardcover, because I hate e-readers, but I do what I can, is Bewilderness. Bewilderness is this really poignant, gripping, like visceral, electric story about two young women who are best friends growing up in rural North Carolina, struggling with their opioid addictions and struggling with poverty and finding their place in the world. This book, it is hard to read, but the main narrator, the main character, is one of the two friends. is so funny and sarcastic and just blunt. And the way that she is aware of her own faults, yet seems incapable in many ways until the end of really holding on to them and looking at them for what they are. This book, as a woman who has very intense female friendships, felt like one of the best representations of female friendship that I've seen. Now, that does not mean that the friendship is always healthy, that it's always trustworthy, that they bring out the best in each other, but they need each other. They are addicted to each other almost in the same way that they're addicted to these drugs. And they do seem to want what's best for each other. They take care of each other. They do have a very specific type of love that I feel I've only experienced with other women, but it is destroying them at the same time that it sustains them. This book is not an easy read whatsoever. It does not have a necessarily happy ending, but as someone whose family is from rural North Carolina, and I've often wondered who I would have been and how I would have turned out if I had stayed in those places that do have these large epidemics of, opioid crisis. As someone who has had very intense female friendships that I have clung to with, white knuckles, even though I know I need to let them go for the betterment of both of us. For someone who could, even though I've never had any drug type experience that these characters have, I felt like I understood what it felt like to think that the entire world is out of your control except for these small specific moments that can make everything beautiful and bright and vivid and worth living. This is the first book I've ever read by this author, and I'm pretty sure it's her debut novel, and I'm so excited to read what comes next because it is a book that feels true. And I'm sure that it is someone's story. I'm sure it's inspired by something, but it feels true even to someone who doesn't live in that place and hasn't been in that experience. Because when it comes down to the crux of it, to decisions and maturity and friendship and the pain of letting go, it's what more can I say? I loved it. I absolutely loved this book. And then just to wrap up the arcs that I read this month, even though this is not in chronological order, I also read The Necklace, which is a dark thriller about a woman whose daughter is murdered 20 years prior, and then in the present day she is on her way to see the convicted killer's execution. And while she is on that journey, crossing those states with very little money in her pocket because she's a working class woman, she finds new evidence that throws into doubt who actually killed her daughter, why they did it, and then that sends a ripple effect throughout the entire book. So as I said, she is on her way to the execution of the man who's convicted of the crime. So she has a very specific ticking clock to try to follow her instincts, use help wherever she can, also figure out how she's going to eat and stay warm at night and just take care of herself. And it's this really beautiful story in terms of the mother, the main character, Susan Lintego, and her wit and her intelligence and her grit, her passion and love for her daughter, and the ways that she figures out the mysteries in the end. Because I will say, even when I was pretty sure I knew who the killer was, I did not know if she knew, and I did not know how she was going to figure out the truth. And when we got to that final moment where she put the pieces together, I was like, I think this is a very tightly wound, very breadcrumbs are well laid out. It allowed me to follow along, but it didn't allow me to figure it out immediately book. And those strengths are what helped me get past the dark stuff. Now, I have read Toni Morrison books on this channel before. I understand heavy, dark material, but I also understand the delicate hand with which to use it and describe it. In this book, content warning, in addition to a child dying, this child is also sexually assaulted before their death. I did not know that before I picked it up. And when I got to that part efficiently, the first time I read it, I was like, okay, this is normally not for me. But by the time I had gotten that far, I was already invested. And I thought, all right, that was the gut punch, the reveal. From here on out, we can focus on the mom and her ragtag group of friends and figuring out this DNA evidence, all this stuff. No, there are multiple times in this book where different characters at various points and varying degrees of descriptiveness explain what happened to her daughter. And I personally felt that some of them were gratuitous. I felt some of them did not serve the narrative. And because this is this book is it's nonlinear storytelling, it jumps back and forth between, her last week with her daughter, the daughter's disappearance and death, and then the immediate aftermath, and then what's happening now. I do understand why there are certain things that are repeated to kind of remind you where we are back and forth. But I just didn't feel like it was necessary in many places. And because I enjoyed the book otherwise, I thought the main character, as I said, was very empathetic, felt very real. I appreciated her as a mom, and I was rooting for her the whole time. I liked the side characters, even though the pace was so quick that we didn't really get to delve as deep into them as I would like. And although it wrapped up neatly at the end and her relationships with them in the epilogue, I felt were very sweet. Still, I really feel like this book could have been like a wow book if the author had pulled back a little on these descriptions and on how often this information was, explicitly said in the narrative. So while I did enjoy it, it is not something that I'll be reading again, probably. Would I read something else by this author? Yes, particularly a thriller. Now, moving away from the arcs, the first book I read was Mind of My Mind by Octavia Butler. Now, this is actually the second in the Bewilderness series, which is a series of several books that Octavia Butler wrote in varying order. And so at this point, I'm going to read them chronologically. So I'm going to read Wild Seed next, which is the first book that was written in the series chronologically, but one of the last books that Octavia Butler wrote in her career. And in Mind of My Mind, you're introduced to Doro and Emma, who are two Black people who have varying supernatural abilities, different from each other, but they're intertwined in their own way. They clearly have a relationship that we're unfamiliar with, but that stretches back till centuries. But the main focus, even though you're introduced to them first, is this young woman named Mary, who is a very powerful telepath. This entire science fiction novel is about Mary, is about her husband, is about the various telepaths who are all descendants and, genetic links to Doro, who is the patriarch of them all, the lover of them all, or many of them, and has a very specific goal in mind when it comes to breeding people, marrying them together, killing them, or saving them to get his particular vision. That does not work out exactly as you might expect when Mary starts to grow into her power. This book I enjoyed and I read very quickly, but as someone who has already read Kindred and Parable of the Sower, I can say that Parable of the Sower and Kindred are stronger in my opinion. And so when I did some research and found that Mind of My Mind was written earlier in Octavia's Butler career, it did make sense. Now let me be clear, even less good as compared to other Octavia Butler's works is still here for me as compared to everybody else's work. So I would recommend this book, but if you're looking to try Octavia Butler for the first time, I maybe would go with one of those other ones. One of the things I really like about this book but I also think is a bit of a critique is I feel that the themes are often more important than the characters. There are a lot of questions and conversations about power, about control, about ownership. There are a lot of conversations about what does it mean to be free, what does it mean to be a slave in a variety of ways, and it's not always lined up racially as you think it's going to be. There's questions of how accountable do you hold someone for being what they were born to be, for doing what they were bred to do. And when it comes to the survival of one race of people over survival of another, how do you justify subjugation? How do you justify oppression? When you have really powerful telepaths on the page, you have the ability to craft characters who can make other people do their will without those other characters even knowing. When is that okay? When is it not? Is it ever okay? And again, when you're in circumstances where none of these people ask to be telepaths, none of these people ask to have all the terrible side effects and psychosis and destructive behaviors that come when you're not powerful enough to become a telepath, but you're still not human, all because Doro had a specific plan, all because Doro was playing God. I really love these themes. I would love to talk to people about these themes, but I often felt when I was reading the book and also reflecting on it, that the themes were so strong that they actually overshadowed the characters. There's not a single character in Mind of My Mind where I'm like, oh, I love this person, or I'd want to be this person, or I can't wait to read another book with this character. They all served a purpose. They all entertained me and annoyed me and made me think and made me cringe in various ways, but I wasn't heavily invested in any of them. And based on some reviews I've read about the other books in the Patternist series, for example, Wild Seed, which is where Doro and Emma originally meet, apparently that character building is incredibly strong and you're equally as invested in them as people and as characters as you are in this greater narrative. So while I did enjoy Mind of My Mind, I did think it felt a little uneven when it came to character development versus plot or theme development. But I still enjoyed it. Now, the final book that I read in January that I saved for the end of this video because I still don't know how I want to talk about it, which is rare for me, is Abarat. Now, this was another one of the books that was on my list of TBR books for the year, and it's something that I've held on to for years. I read it when I was younger and I really loved it, and I want to revisit it as an adult and hope that I would love it again. I also thought that if I enjoyed it, this could fill one of my other reading goals for the year, and this be the series that I finish because there are 3 books. So I was wrong on 2 fronts. There are actually 5 books, not 3. The 4th one is being released this year, and the 5th one will be who knows. And my second mistake was thinking that I would like this because I didn't. Kind of. So the story of Abarat is a young adult fantasy novel about an average young woman, or so you think, called Candy Quackenbush, who is whisked away to the magical archipelago of Abarat, where there are 25 islands, 24 for each hour / time of the day, and the 25th, a mystical place that no one has ever survived a visit to, the time out of time. Now, this is very obviously the first book in a series, which is one of my first critiques. You're introduced to a whole bunch of characters, various antagonists. Candy doesn't go to every island in Aberrat, but she gets around to a lot of them, doing a major layout of the land. And you're introduced to minor side characters who are Aberratian, who also give a lot of exposition and backstory about prophecies and a time of darkness and evil creatures that live under the sea and greedy capitalists who want to take over the world and really scary grandmothers who make armies of people out of mud and skin and rags. Like, there's a lot going on here, and I commend Clive Barker for his creativity and his vision. I love the structure of this world. I think it's unique. I think it's something that I've never seen before. I love that he included hundreds of paintings so you can actually see what his vision of this world was. I love that in the first book, Candy does dispel some of those tropes of the classic white YA young girl. She's impulsive, she gets angry. There are moments where she logically deduces the next thing to do, which I know sounds like a low bar, but there are so many books in which the main character is just pulled to and fro. And because she is being pursued by antagonists and helped by friends, there is a bit of that, but there are very specific scenes where by paying attention to her surroundings, by thinking back to information that someone else told her, she saved her life and the lives of other people simply by just being quick, which I enjoyed. Another thing I enjoyed about this book is that the way that Clive Barker introduced the antagonist made it clear that it was not going to be a cookie cutter, this is the Dark Lord, that's it. There's actually 3 people introduced in the first book, Abarat, that all have clearly nefarious backstories, clearly have the potential to be the big bad, but all 3 of them are already in conflict with each other. They already have their own nuances and their own, plans and preferences. And I ended up reading the summaries of the other 2 books, so I know how that ends up, and I can appreciate how Clive set this up. And the downsides. I didn't want to finish this book. I kept wanting to be more invested than I was. I kept wanting to be more interested than I was. But even with all the compliments that I just gave, I just could not get myself into this book. And once I read the summaries of the second and third book, I realized exactly where my desire to know what happened next and the effort it took to read the book crossed. Because if the Abarat and the 2 next books were movies on Netflix, I'd watch them immediately, because there are certain scenes that I am glad I read. There are certain moments that I'm like, oh wow, that'd be cool to actually see that play out on screen. And there were lines and I'm like, oh, that was pretty funny. Like, there are parts that I enjoyed, but I did not feel that those parts warranted the amount of effort it took to get through the book, which is harsh to say, but that was just my experience. Another thing that I took issue with, which is small, but I noticed that someone pointed out, there are only 3 Black characters in this world. And the reason I know that they're Black is because each of them are introduced with Name, who was black, da-da-da-da-da. Person who was black, grab candy. Person who was black, clutch the bow. Person who was black, clutch your sword. Like, that's the framework of it. And it was so awkward because each black character was introduced in that way, and it just said who was black. And that felt very simple and lazy to me, because in the world of Abarat, so like a tiny spoiler, but this will make sense, tons of people speak English, and the scale, the spectrum of humanoid to creature to completely mythical to looking like, you or me, that range happens because Abarat and our world, which is called the hereafter in that book, were in trade for many, many years. So there were interspecies, interrelationship, intercontinental relationships. And that is why you have this big swath of people. So every other character who was not introduced as who was black was described as pale or acidic looking. They had a sallow face. They had, silvery eyes with tinges of blue in their pale skin. Like, all of these really beautiful, vivid, descriptive ways of talking about the different skin tones and the different, physiologies of these people. Yet the three black characters, all they got was who was black. And it just stuck out to me because Barker had already put in so much work to creatively describe all these other people, and it just didn't seem necessary. And although I did compliment some of the ways I felt that he kind of pushed back against, the young YA girl trope, there also were moments where it was very prevalent, and I was like, okay, let's move through this. Yes, we have the whole thing of I'm just an everyday girl who's ordinary. Turns out I'm not ordinary. You had the hinted, which may or may not be confirmed later, subplot of reincarnation. She's someone who the very first time she tries magic, despite never studying it, is amazing at it. Maybe that's tied to the hinted reincarnation. We don't know. There are various moments such as that I'm like, okay, obviously I don't expect my main protagonist, a 15, 16-year-old girl, to get killed in the first chapter. But I think especially because I felt that he was pushing it back against some of those expectations and other parts of the book, the moments where it's like, okay, now we're going to rely back on this. Okay, we're setting up a love triangle here. Okay, we're setting up this, but you don't understand me, mom thing. I was like, okay. I have talked about this book a lot, and I hope you can tell that I probably haven't said much. If in what I described to you makes you want to pick it up, please do, because I'm 100% sure that all of my critiques in this are personal, are more subjective than usual, and I think more than anything, this is a matter of it's just not for me. So that being said, that was the end of my January wrap up. I hope that this month, I claim that February will be better, perhaps not in readings. I can't imagine I'm going to read as much this month, but right here, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically. I am going to go try to stay awake for another 8 hours before I'm allowed to go to sleep, but I hope you have a good day.